Hi, I'm Dr. L.J. Punch, trauma surgeon and medical director of the Bullet-Related Injury Clinic, known as the BRIC. Bullet-related injury is a term that you might not have heard in quite that way before. It's frequently called gun violence. But bullet-related injury, for us, represents the constellation of physical, mental, and spiritual impacts that a bullet injury has, not just in the body of the person who has been shot, but in the lives of everyone around them. And that injury is best characterized as a break in trust, an inability to trust other people, and honestly, even an inability to trust oneself. Why is bullet-related injury damaging in that way? I have been trying really hard to understand this, not just as an outpatient clinic provider, but even as a trauma surgeon. And the thing that I come up with over and over and over again is that bullets have a tremendous capacity to go deep into our lives and convey that we are not safe. And so taking care of someone who has bullet-related injury requires a huge amount of attention to not re-traumatizing that broken trust. Because as soon as that is done, it is almost as if we, as healthcare providers, have managed to drive the bullet deeper. In this presentation and training, we want to do two things. We want to present to you bullet-related injury as a model for the ways in which we can do transformative trauma-responsive care, and just simply start by being aware of the trauma that's in our patients' bodies and families' lives. But we can't do that without first recognizing how much that same bullet-related injury might be present in you. Join us on this journey to explore what it is to be trauma-aware and use the lens of bullet-related injury as we present not just the reality of trauma and not just the charge to be trauma-aware, but we share with you the precious gift that we're developing right here in St. Louis, the Bullet-Related Injury Clinic, which I view as an answer to that deeply broken trust. So I challenge you to take this training into your practice, into your minds, and into your workday, but do it knowing that we see you, and that you matter, and that this work is pushing hard to change the trajectory of bullets, one patient and one healthcare professional at a time.
Hi, my name is Kristen Simpson. Today, we're going to start a discussion about trauma. And as we dive into this content, I want to remind everyone that's watching to be mindful of your own emotions as we kind of go over the layers of how trauma impacts each of us. Please, as we go through this presentation, take time and take space as you need it to pause, stop, and reflect or regroup as necessary. Let's dive into the content. As we dive deeper into this trauma awareness conversation, you'll hear us talk a lot about the word lens. When we say lens, we mean how are we perceiving people and situations? So one of the first conversations we're going to have is just to talk about how we shift our lens. What are the stories that we tell ourselves about other people's behavior? What do we assume about why they're showing up the way that they show up? When we see these behaviors that don't seem normal to us, that are being displayed by our coworkers, the people that we serve, our friends, our family, we may say things like, what's wrong with them? Why do they always act like this? They're always angry. They choose to be this way. When in reality, there is a root cause to the behavior or the attitude that we're experiencing. So we want to change those questions and those statements that we tell ourselves about the behaviors that we see and experience. So instead of asking, what's wrong with you or what's wrong with them, try asking what happened to you and what's continuing to happen to you. As we understand, it is the things that happen to us that then shape how we show up in the world. So you'll hear us frame that question quite a bit during this presentation. And as we move along in the content, we'll just start talking about what trauma is so that we understand, by definition, what it is at the phrase that we're discussing. What is trauma? The way that we describe trauma is by first identifying the 3 E's. The 3 E's represent the event, the experience, and the effects of a particular situation. The event of trauma is the actual thing that happens, whether that's an actual threat or a perceived threat to safety that causes us and our bodies to respond and protect. The experience is how we assign meaning to the event. So let me break that down just for a second. An example could be a car accident. Maybe 2 people get in a car accident and it's a fender bender and everyone is safe, no one's hurt, everyone is able to walk away fine. But maybe one of the people in that car accident had a prior experience where that car accident was pretty traumatic. Maybe they lost loved ones during that previous car accident. Maybe they suffered many injuries that left them in the hospital for several months. Maybe getting in the car just to drive is difficult for them today. And so while if I'm the other person on that end of the car accident, the fender bender, and I'm like, hey, we're alive, we're good, no one's hurt, I got insurance, I walk away fine. But the other person that may have had a previous experience with a car accident may be stuck at the wheel, anxious, or emotionally dysregulated because the repeat car accident actually triggered a previous memory in time. So that could be really explaining how the event and the experience will look different for anyone. That leads us to talking about effects. So how will those events, the way we experience it and assign meaning to it, affect us in our everyday life? For example, if we continue to talk about the incidents of the car accident, that person who had a traumatic experience at a younger age with cars now has to face, do I feel safe driving? Do I feel safe being in any car, whether I'm driving or not? Am I paranoid about people and the way that they drive? Has it really changed the way that when I get behind the wheel, I'm suffering from situational anxiety? That is the effects. And so maybe that person decides, I just don't want to drive because it feels unsafe, because it brings up too many harsh memories, because I can't get past thinking that every time I'm behind the wheel, I'll get in a car accident. And so when we think about event, experience, and effects, this is how things that happen to us can shape the way that we show up and the way that we interact with the world today. But we can't just think about trauma as a one and done type of situation. We look at trauma as something that can happen across the lifespan, as well as there are several people that experience chronic trauma. Chronic trauma refers to multiple traumatic events happening to the same person. It could be the same type of event occurring over a period of time, like physical or sexual abuse, or it could be different types of events that occur to the same person over a period of time. As we think about the impact of chronic trauma, we want to think about it as a cumulative occurrence and not be viewed as separate discrete events. Each subsequent event brings forward memories and reactions from the previous event. Chronic trauma is also connected to toxic stress, or the kind of stress that negatively impacts the body because of continuous activation of the stress response, which we'll talk a little bit more about further along in the content. These include examples like living in poverty, chronic hunger, or living in violent neighborhoods. When we see chronic trauma, we are typically seeing the most devastating impact on an individual's functioning in all areas, and what we typically would be referring to throughout this presentation. We think about chronic trauma as it's one thing after another, after another, after another. So now we'll begin to break down the different types of trauma that we see. One of those examples is private event trauma. When we're talking about private event trauma, we're talking about things that happen to people that they keep in secrecy. And sometimes the reason behind keeping it a secret is because people feel embarrassed, or they feel like they'll be labeled, or there's a power dynamic between their abuser or attacker that forces them to remain in solitude with what they're dealing with. Some of those examples look like sexual abuse. Another example is physical abuse, or issues with finances, or substance use disorder. Those are situations that people deal with, but they don't explicitly talk about with even their loved ones. So the next type of trauma is public event trauma. This type of trauma is characterized by shared experience, lack of judgment, sense of helplessness, forces beyond control, and sense of irretrievable loss. Public events that can be traumatic include natural disasters like tornadoes, pandemics, flooding, car accidents, painful or prolonged medical treatments, war, or crime victimization. These events typically are shared experiences and talked about with others. There is typically no judgment attached initially to being involved with the event. Individuals experiencing a public traumatic event often report a sense of helplessness. This may come from feeling that they have no ability to avoid or prevent the event from happening. We can't stop a tornado. We can't stop a pandemic. And like with those experiencing private traumatic events, a sense of irretrievable loss is also often reported. Another trauma we would like to discuss is community trauma. This type of trauma is characterized by a combination of experiences that negatively impact a community. An event that impacts a few people but has structural and social consequences. We often think of trauma as a solo focus on interpersonal trauma, but when we shift our thinking, we have to begin to include the community impact that has the same potential effects of an interpersonal trauma. Another community trauma is our most recent school shooting and how we are still grieving and processing that occurrence. But as a community, we responded to that trauma collectively. Historical trauma. This is characterized by intergenerational, and it is not just about what happened in the past, but it's also about what is happening right now and still continuing to happen. These experiences can result in accumulative emotional and psychological wounds that are carried across generations. There are many situations of historical trauma that impact us all. When we think about historical trauma specific to healthcare, what does the history tell us about how we interact with different populations of people? We think about areas that have flourishing medical centers, and then some places don't. When we think about the Delmar Divide and how that broke certain communities and put barriers of access for people to get quality health care. If we dig a little deeper into that history, what does it say? And then how can we use that as a reference point in understanding how people come into our system, how that trust may not be there, because historically, some individuals were not viewed as a priority or that they even mattered. What is your history of the organization that you represent? And I challenge you to think about this as an opportunity to help you grow and expand your perspective, but also as you reference that information, that you take it to close a gap so that we can make systems more equitable for all of those who need them. Another trauma we like to identify is racial trauma. Racial trauma is characterized by mental, emotional, physical injury caused by racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. Race-based experiences have detrimental psychological and physiological impacts on individuals and their wider communities. Cumulative effects of experiencing individual events of racism and living within a system that perpetuates racism. One of the traumas that often is left out of the conversation is vicarious trauma. The trauma that impacts us. The traumas that we hear from the stories that we are told, especially as healthcare professionals. What are the stories that we hear from the patients that we service day to day? We also take on all of the traumatic things that they're experiencing. We hear it and we respond to them. We may share anger with them. We may share sadness with them. And sometimes when we're hearing positive stories, we'll share excitement. But that's just an example of how the stories you hear can impact your own emotions. Because on top of vicarious trauma, you have your own personal life, your own personal responsibilities, and things that you're also navigating when you show up to work. And then in your service, you onboard the personal life experiences of those that you serve, and maybe even those that you work beside as well. So remembering that vicarious trauma, we call it secondary traumatic stress disorder because we are receiving those traumatic stories secondhand from those that we're caring for. So vicarious trauma, by definition, is an indirect trauma that we are exposed to while we're providing services. So there is limited recognition of the various types of trauma that may impact an individual. Often only interpersonal trauma is recognized having an impact. And while interpersonal trauma is often viewed as more correlated and tangible, lying underneath all of the adverse community environments, which is the community trauma. Community trauma has roots in historical mechanisms like racism, historical oppression of certain ethnic groups and religious backgrounds, and transgenerational poverty. While there is a national narrative of historical trauma, each individual community has its own unique presence of historical trauma that layers on top of the national narrative. Historical trauma is the result of systemic oppression, and systemic oppression continues to fuel historical trauma to this day. Now that we kind of have an understanding of the definition of trauma, the 3 E's, layers of trauma, I want to talk about where trauma starts. And we use this model called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. So I want to welcome you to watch this video about adverse childhood experiences and how they impact us at a very young age and across our lifespan.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Anda and Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
So now that we've talked about the ACEs, the original ACE study had 10 original indicators. But in Philadelphia, conducted a study in 2012 or 2013 to add an additional 5 indicators that encompassed some groups of individuals that weren't included in the original study. These 5 newly identified ACE indicators include witnessing violence, living in unsafe neighborhoods, experiencing racism, living in foster care, and experiencing bullying. In identifying these, we see that adverse community environments driven by historical trauma and structural inequity can amplify the impact of the adverse childhood experiences that are experienced across all demographics. So as we think about the pair of ACEs and the experiences that occur in childhood, we look at this pair of ACEs tree. And what you see on the pair of ACEs tree is the indicators that we talked about in the first study. Things like emotional and sexual abuse, mental illness, physical and emotional neglect, divorce, incarceration, homelessness, domestic violence. The way that we look at this tree is that is the tree that gets rooted and grows. And what is it that's in our soil? What is it in our soil that is contributing to that tree that we grow? Poverty is in there, discrimination, lack of opportunity and economic mobility and social capital, poor housing quality and affordability, and violence. Those are the things that are in our roots, embedded into our nation and embedded into our communities. We can expect that we'll see pair of ACEs grow out of those root initiatives. So how do we dig up that soil, identify those things that are holding us back, and plant a different tree with rich soil that includes community healing and collective responding to the inequities that we face and experience on a day-to-day basis? Moving on from the tree, we also have to acknowledge the social determinants of health. Things like education access and quality, healthcare and quality, neighborhood and built environment, social and community context, and economic stability all contribute to one's ability to receive quality healthcare. When we think about the social determinants of health, we need to think about where the communities people are coming from to engage with us. What are the access points that they have that allows them to get quality care? Or is that a barrier that we haven't yet identified? Our stress response system gets activated when we're faced with stressful situations. Our mind and body automatically respond in one of three ways. That's fight, flight, or freeze. Now that we briefly talked about how our stress response system gets activated, I want to welcome you to watch this video and talking about how our brain responds to trauma.
The problem with trauma is that it starts off with something that happens to us, but that's not where it stops, because it changes your brain. Much of the imprint of trauma is in that very primitive survival part of your brain that I like to call the cockroach brain. There's a part of you that just picks up what's dangerous and what's safe. And when you're traumatized, that little part of your brain, which is usually very quiet, continues to just send messages. I'm in danger. I'm not safe. That event itself is over, but you continue to react to things as if you're in danger. We are talking about survival. We are talking about staying alive. And so some people go into fight-flight, or on a more primitive level, people's brain shuts down and they collapse. You have these automatic responses that are not a product of your cognitive assessment, they're a product of your animal brain trying to stay alive in the face of something that that part of your brain interprets as a life threat. And the problem then becomes that you are not able to engage, or to learn, or to see other people's point of view, or to coordinate your feelings with your thinking. Traumatized people have a tremendous problem experiencing pleasure and joy. But the core issue is our hormones and our physiological impulses that have to do with survival. Your body keeps mobilizing itself to fight. You have all kinds of immunological abnormalities, endocrine abnormalities, and that really devastates your physical health also. Oftentimes the physical problems are longer lasting than the mental problems. And the other thing that is terribly important is the impact of poverty, or the impact of racism, or the impact of unemployment.
That dashed line is our normal range of window of tolerance. On the outside, you have this activating agent. The activating agent is something that happens to us, whether that's a traumatic event, a repeated event, or a trigger. This activating agent then spews off a response from our autonomic nervous system, and it can push us to either hyperarousal or hypoarousal. In hyperarousal, it can often look like anxiety, panic, rage, or hyperactivity. It could also look like you may scan the environment for risk of danger, mania, or hypervigilance. Hypoarousal can look like depression, dissociative episodes, fatigue, and/or numbness. And it can impact your day-to-day functioning.
Earlier this year, I was working in the Galleria and I got shot. I'm sitting on the table bleeding. I'm like, man, where's the surgeon at? Excuse me, it's been hours. Where's the surgeon at? Like, I couldn't feel my hand, and I got shot in my hand right here. Because I had went like this when I was getting shot, whatever. I'm like, man, I can't feel my hand. It's been hours. Can I please get a surgeon? Police came in there more times than the doctor did. You know what I'm saying? Trying to ask me who shot me. I'm like, they like the hospitals, man, they just, don't nobody like the hospital. They don't deal with your trauma. They don't help you with your mental state. They don't spiritually uplift you. They don't do none of that. They just try to physically patch you up.
What the current medical establishment or the mainstream medical establishment does really well is you got a hole in your body, let's, fix whatever is going on inside of you, let's sew you back up, and oh great, now you're in one piece, go off into the world and live your life. That remedies maybe the hole in the body, but that doesn't fix the trauma. The way that trauma just ripples and reverberates around an entire person's life and community.
I was not aware of my trauma. I didn't know, I knew of trauma, but I was like, okay, I'm one of the people who don't have any trauma. Like, my life is okay, as I thought. To see that I am trauma and I am walking trauma was eye-opening, because now I see, all my problems.
One thing that I also was pretty lucky to learn throughout college was kind of like the social determinants of health. I think like violence is a product of segregation. Violence is a product of like lack of public housing, lack of good public education, lack of good healthcare. All these things like play into how we see violence manifest itself in our community. And the only thing you can do, you don't enter that community with judgment. You have to understand that that violence is a reaction oftentimes to trauma that has not been addressed.
The beginning part is basically me having to deal with my own personal trauma, and then working within a trauma-based facility, along with being able to meet other people, not just myself, but also being able to meet with people who have lived it and still, going through it. August 13th, 2015, my daughter was murdered due to gun violence. Her and her friend was standing outside on the sidewalk talking. Her son was inside the vehicle and her sister was standing to the front of her vehicle. Someone came down the street in a truck and started shooting. As parents, we think our children, are the ones that are supposed to bury us. We never imagine having to be without a child. But my trauma began August 13th, 2015. That's when my trauma began for me. I felt lost, hurt, angry, having to deal with, where do I go from here? How am I going to be able to function? Life threw me a curveball and it just completely broke me. I didn't know what to do.
In college, I spent many of my weekends rotating with different ambulance services throughout the state of Texas, earning my paramedic license. And I remember thinking the hospital was so much more controlled and sterile than the scene we had just come from, where family members were screaming, where just like the sirens, the smells, there was never good lighting. It was so different from the like clean and controlled environment of the hospital. But I remember taking patients away from traumatic scenes and realizing that the only person who was going to get care that night was the patient that we're taking to the hospital. But everybody who just witnessed what happened is traumatized from it. And I always felt bad pulling away from really bad scenes where I knew that the family and the friends and everyone around had just witnessed something terrible, but we don't really have a structure to help care for them after.
I've dealt with traumas, but seeing my sister get killed, because even though it wasn't necessarily me getting shot, I still was there when she was shot. Sometimes I don't even have the words to say. It's unbearable.
we want to take a moment to re-reference how trauma impacts the body as a whole. Trauma can greatly impact a patient in several ways. As we address trauma across the lifespan, we think about the nervous system as being our command center. Originating from our brain, it controls our movements, our thoughts, our automatic responses to the world around us. It also controls other elements such as digestion, breathing, and development. Traumatic events push the nervous system outside of its ability to regulate itself, and thus other systems within our bodies are affected. So now what? Now that we understand what trauma is and how it impacts the people that we serve, we need to recognize that the prevalence of trauma is very high, and our recognition of trauma is low, meaning that our systems are underprepared to address trauma-related issues proactively and may struggle to address trauma effectively. This trauma-informed healthcare model means that we need to change our practice to better support those we serve and also those who are doing the serving.
When it started, I didn't know anything. I didn't have any coping skills. I would just suppress everything. Anything that dealt with my daughter. Trauma affects you mentally, physically, emotionally, just on everyday basis. You know, if it affects the way you eat, sleep, it affects all of it. And unless you find you a support group, unless you find you a therapist, you know, someone that you can confide in that can help you with your process of healing, you're gonna lose it all. Because I was lost.
When we first launched the BRIC, we were following up with patients in like 24 hours. We were trying to be really aggressive, and we noticed that patients weren't yet ready to really be interested in seeing us. They were still reeling from what had happened and were in fight or flight response. But we've noticed that by reaching out to them in like 48 to 72 hours, that's the time where they're starting to experience peak pain, more inflammation, their wound is oozing, they have more questions, and that's really a good time when they want to interact with us. And so by being responsive to the needs of the patient, we're able to establish ourselves as a therapeutic resource.
We try to strike a good balance between the clinical aspect and a much deeper and richer therapeutic experience. And so our patients come to us for wound care, but it's a recognition of that is one small, very small piece of healing from trauma.
I remember there being one family where the son was shot, and he came several weeks in a row with his brother and his two parents. And in the first week, we really talked to the son about what happened, and it was very practical, the information we were giving, the questions they had. But they kept coming back, and the more they were able to open up, it was just really interesting to see how this injury, the son, of course, was impacted by it, but the brother was impacted. The brother is concerned about his safety, but the mom had guilt and also kind of this fear of what other people would think that her son was shot. And it was really rewarding to talk to the whole family and to kind of be able to help them open up and help them talk about this incident where I don't think they would have had that opportunity if we hadn't been there.
When family members, friends, mentors, coaches, people's support system comes and brings a patient in, we always try to engage those people during the visit too. Just asking them, how are you doing? How are you coping? We recognize that you as the support system are being affected by this trauma. It's not just the person that has the injury. And how just extending that acknowledgement can really open up into relationship building and support network building for the patient, because their whole team feels engaged, feels invested in the types of therapeutic interventions that we're doing, can apply them for themselves, and so that they are healing as well as they are trying to support this other healing person.
When an individual walks in for the first time, we walk them through our How to Heal sheet that essentially describes to them the process of trauma, right? So when you have a traumatic event, your sympathetic nervous system, which is the feeling that you get of fight or flight, of I either need to get the hell out of here or I need to fight, I need to do something about it. That's what you feel when that initial thing happens. And then oftentimes patients are like, yeah, okay, now there's like a name to that experience, which is already helpful. And you talk them through how normally when you experience minor inconveniences or stressors in life, that trauma, you experience it goes to the emotion center, you feel a certain type of way, but then after that, it goes into your hippocampus, which is a memory center. And it's something in the back of your mind. It's not something that you think about every day. When you stub your toe, you get annoyed, but then you don't really think about it a week later. What happens when you have a bullet-related injury or some other really significant trauma is that this loop gets disrupted. Instead of going from that emotion center to the long-term memory, it just keeps going back to that sympathetic system, which is why you feel all those emotions and anxiety that you're doing. And this is a concept that is a relatively hard biological or scientific concept to explain, but if you do it in a way that centers them and their experience around that, they now leave that 2-3 minute conversation with a deep understanding of the biological processes undergoing what they're undergoing.
I had to figure it out. It wasn't my first time being shot, cause I got shot a couple years ago too. One day I was thinking about, I told my brother, man, I think about death all the time. I think about murders and stuff, you know what I'm saying? That's all I be seeing or whatever. He man, you can't go your whole life thinking about death because you might be alive for a long time. You know what I'm saying? Because I told him, I think I'm finna die. I kept telling him, I think I'm finna die. And he's just bro, don't think about it. He said, don't think about it for your whole life because you might be one of the persons that live for a long time. So I had to get it out of my head, you know what I'm saying? Because I was traumatized by what I went through, but I got it out of my head, so. I guess you gotta grasp and learn on your own how to let things go.
So now we're going to take a moment to talk about the core principles. We see this model as an example and roadmap to how we can start to build flourishing relationships with our patients and our colleagues and other people in the community. The core principles include concepts such as safety, trustworthiness, choice, empowerment, and collaboration. When we do all these things together, they are just pieces to the larger puzzle that leads us to equity. So let's first talk about safety. Safety ensures physical and emotional safety, recognizing and responding to how racial, ethnic, religious, and sexual identity may impact safety. Trustworthiness, to foster genuine relationships and practices that build trust, making tasks clear, maintaining appropriate boundaries, and creating norms for interaction that promotes reconciliation and healing. Understand and respond to ways in which explicit and implicit power can affect the development of trusting relationships. This includes acknowledging and mitigating internal biases and recognizing the historic power of majority populations. Choice. Maximizing choice, addressing how privilege, power, and historic relationships impact both perceptions about and ability to act upon choice. Collaboration. Honor transparency and self-determination and seek to minimize the impact of the inherent power differential while maximizing collaboration and sharing responsibility for making meaningful decisions. Empowerment. Encouraging self-efficacy, identifying strengths, and building skills, which leads to individual pathways for healing while recognizing and responding to the impact of historical trauma and oppression. If we can build psychologically safe environments as people enter into our space, and not just those we serve, but even those that we work beside, they are more likely to trust us. When we're trying to understand not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, we are more likely to get the answer that we seek. But also remembering that people don't owe us their testimonies or their stories. And we allow the safety and space for people to share as much or as little as they desire. But when we create safe environments, We invite trust into that atmosphere. And when we have trust, we share choice with our patients, we share choice with our colleagues, we share choice with our staff, allowing people to have control over the parts of their lives that they should have control over. When a choice can be made, whether that's by patient, by colleague, by family member, by friend, then we offer people that choice, even if we don't like the choice that they choose. The part about being trauma-informed is that our job as healthcare professionals and clinicians is to educate. We are the healthcare GPS to guide them and navigate them into their health choices. And then even with our best recommendation, if they choose something differently, we don't know their ability to adhere to the treatment regimen. And so thus, when we take choice away, we make our own narrative up of why people didn't do the things that we recommended for them. And being trauma informs me that our job is to educate, inform, and allow them to make the best choice for their situation, and then support them through it. So if we can be safe, build trust, offer choice, when we offer choice, we invite the opportunity for people to ask more follow-up questions. And then at that point, we're collaborating. And when we collaborate, we are then sharing that power dynamic that we know exists in healthcare. When we collaborate, we work together, because I can't treat you without you. And we would hope that CEOs and leaders could understand that the hospital cannot operate without the opinions and testimonies of staff members in that space that are frontline. Last but not least, empowerment. When you make me feel safe and I trust you and you let me make choices and you ask my opinion and we discuss things, it is incredibly empowering to feel like I am a part of this. How are we inviting people to participate in this? And when you feel empowered by doing something, you're more likely to stay engaged. So in remembering these core principles, remember those narratives to help you. Hey, am I being safe right now? Have we built the trust for me to have this conversation that I need to have? Am I offering them choice, or am I telling them what they should do? Am I working with them, or am I making the decisions and just showing them what's right and what's wrong? Am I empowering them to be an active participant in this process?
We're here to help. We're not passing judgment on you. We're not looking at you in a demeaning fashion. We know everyone goes through different situations. We know people have trauma.
A lot of times in the first visits and the first interactions I have with our patients, they invest considerable energy and an emphasis on making sure that I understand that they did nothing to deserve this. We very intentionally want to cultivate an environment where nobody feels like they are being accused of something. But the assumption from the get-go going in is like, this person is going to think that I deserved this trauma.
There's very small things that can have such a profound impact on people coming in here, like making them feel heard, listening to them, asking them, how are you doing? Which is like an insane thing to think that nobody's really asked them that on a genuine level.
Number one thing people look at is your wording. How do you translate to get them to let their guard down, because they're already feeling, guarded. They're already feeling, in a position of, if I do this, if I say this, what if, that fear or that anxiety or that panic is already set in. We know the outer shell can appear a certain way, but if I was to sit down in front of you and just do my happy-go-lucky, you would never think something was wrong unless you dug at a question. If you're not saying specific words or things that I know that makes me feel comfortable to where I express to you, I'm gonna give you bare minimum. Oh, it's okay, somewhat. Unsure, but I just know this. Okay, bye. Thank you. It's the conversation piece.
We had an individual come in who got hit by a stray bullet in his car, and it's been 2 to 3 weeks. He doesn't feel comfortable in his car. He's not, able to drive, but if his girlfriend or partner is driving, he just gets panic attacks. It's independent of the actual injury. You know, their bleeding is controlled, their wound is healing properly, but their mental state is almost as if it's the day after the actual event. It's been 3 weeks, right? You just make them feel safe and let them know that at the very least, this is a place that they can feel safe, and that we are here for them, no matter what they need. It's so interesting because here, one of the first things I learned was when a patient comes in for their first visit, we want that visit to be at least 1 hour. Centering the patient and their care over all else. That's why we exist. And also realizing that like that bullet wound, we can do everything right, but that the mental trauma or the emotional baggage that they're dealing with is a continual process. And it's one that the only thing we can do at this point is make them feel safe and give them the resources to feel empowered over their journey of, recovery.
Took the class, took the How to Heal class, and first thing I learned that it's not your fault. It's not your fault your daughter is no longer here. I learned coping skills, how to take, breaths in the morning, take your time, reset yourself, and just take it day by day.
By changing the community's ability to respond to violence, I think that changes the experience of violence. I think that changes the traumatization of violence.
Trauma. We all know it's a bad thing, but you can turn your trauma into something positive, you know what I'm saying? If you train your mind to do that, because some people get traumatized and they never become untraumatized,
Before I thought the goal was we have somebody at baseline, then they are shot, and then we have this temporary disruption, but we get them back up to baseline, and that's great. There's so much trauma just circulating the communities. Baseline is not ideal either. And we had this one patient come in who we sat down with the whole team. It was during a lull on Saturday, and he just was talking with us kind of casually about his experience in the program. He spoke on how before the injury, he was feeling very lost. He suffered this horrible traumatic injury, which is a terrible experience. But what stuck with me was he was like, I wouldn't say I'm glad that it happened, but it ended up being a positive thing because it got me here. And it was an opportunity for him to not just slap a Band-Aid on the wound, but to really take stock of how is this event impacting my life? And really what's going on in my life that is causing all this stress, causing all this trauma? How do we shift and transform?
If we could kind of harness that energy for change, that desire to find meaning in this horrific event, the bullet injury is no longer the worst day of their life, but the beginning of a new life.
As you're on this journey to change systems and culture, remember that a program or an organization or system that is trauma-informed responds by using the 4 R's. Being trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential pathways for recovery. Being trauma-informed recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved within the system. Being trauma-informed responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, as well as being trauma-informed seeks to actively resist re-traumatization to those that we serve and those of us who do the serving. As we think about interventions for trauma, we need to understand that trauma is not cured, that there are therapeutic interventions that are available across all ages that can help support. But we are unable to erase the traumatic events that happen to us. And sometimes people need more support than others. Also remember that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. We know, as the science tells us, that it only takes one buffering, supportive individual that can mitigate the trajectory of trauma across someone's lifespan. So as we think about responding to trauma, we must acknowledge that we may unintentionally trigger someone's trauma response. We work to see an individual's response and behavior as a result of changes in the brain and the body, and we strive to see the world through the lens of trauma.